The first time Nora found the antler on her porch, she thought a hunter had left it as a joke. The second morning, a smooth black river stone appeared beside it. On the third, a single raven feather lay on top, and a shadow moved between the trees. Nora had never been much for superstition, but she believed in patterns. In snow that always drifted deepest against the north wall. In creek water that ran clearer after 3 dry days. In the way chickadees went silent 2 minutes before a storm arrived. She trusted the land because the land didn't lie, it just repeated itself in ways a person could learn if they stayed long enough and kept their eyes open. The morning she found the antler, the world was damp and bright. Rain had passed in the night, leaving everything beaded and shining, the porch rail, the mossy steps, the blackberry canes along the path. Nora opened the door to the smell of wet bark and a wind that carried distant river cold in it. She stepped out, pulling her sweater tight, and nearly put her foot on what she first took for a twisted root. It was a shed antler, fresh and clean, the ivory tines smooth where they'd rubbed against alder and fir all winter. It wasn't common to find one laid perfectly against a threshold. Hunters sometimes walked the lower track in spring, but none would climb the last half-mile in the rain to set a trophy on an old woman's step. Nora crouched slowly, one hand on the rail to steady her knee, and lifted the antler. It held a surprising warmth from the porch boards, as if it hadn't been there long. She turned it in her hands and could almost see the buck that had worn it, wary eyes, a lifting of the head to listen, the sudden lightness when winter's weight snapped free. "Who brought you here?" she asked the morning. By noon, she'd leaned the antler against the wall beside the door, not quite ready to bring it inside, as though it belonged to weather and sap more than to rooms and walls. She made tea. Cut a slice of the brown bread she baked every Sunday. Watched mist rise, shred, then pull back into the trees. She told herself she'd figure out the joke when she walked the track to the mailbox. The second morning gave her the stone. It was laid precisely beside yesterday's antler, black as cooled pitch, heavy for its size, the sort of river rock you find only where water tumbles hard and scours. She knew the bends and riffles within 3 miles and had never seen one quite like it. She set the stone on the antler's palm and stood very still, listening to a forest that seemed, suddenly, to be listening back. The third morning, the feather. Raven, by the shine and the shape, by the soft oil smell that clung when she turned it in her fingers. It lay across the stone and antler like a ribbon on a wrapped gift. Nora felt a small pull in her chest then, not fear, exactly, but a tightening that said, "This isn't accident." She looked up, past the porch, past the slow droplets falling from cedar tips, and saw the shadow. Between 2 boles where the ground dipped toward the creek, a shape stood darker than bark and broader than any stump. Not moving. Not looming. Simply there, as if part of the same pattern as rain and chickadees and river-cold wind. Breath rose from it in slow, pale curls. When the head turned, the light caught eyes that were not the flat glass of a statue but the wet, living dark of something watching for her watching. "Hello," Nora said, because what else does a person say to a memory wearing a mountainside's weight? She hadn't seen him in years, not truly. Sometimes she'd swear she glimpsed a broad back slide between firs at dusk, or heard a log rolled over with a sound too forceful to be wind. But the last time she'd been close enough to count the thrum of breath, he'd been no taller than her hip and shaking so hard she'd thought his bones would rattle apart. That night had been all flood and thunder. The ravine, normally a polite trickle, had become a churning throat. She'd been foolish to go out with a lantern, foolish and irreparably human, unable to sit still while she thought she heard crying carry on water. She'd scrambled down on her backside, boots slipping, hands skinned to meet, and there he'd been, a cub clinging to roots, eyes fogged with cold, mouth opening and closing in silent pleas because the noise of water stole any sound he tried to make. She'd not so much lifted him as gathered him like a load of firewood, braced his small ribs against her chest, and hauled them both back up through bracken and slick dirt while the lantern flame guttered and flared. He'd been all teeth and fear and failing strength. His claws had pricked her through wool but never raked. His head had found the hollow of her shoulder as if he'd been built for it. She'd set him by the stove, rubbed him down with the old towel that used to be a flour sack, fed him honey-thinned milk by the spoonful until he blinked in the light like someone waking from a bad dream. She'd kept watch until first graying, and when the water dropped back into its rock bed and the world remembered its edges, she'd carried him to the alder meadow and let the day take him back. Nora had told no one. She wasn't afraid of being called foolish, she simply understood that some rescues belonged to two hearts and a single terrible night. Now the shadow between the trees shifted weight, as if testing the idea that time could collapse into the space of a porch and three small offerings. Nora didn't move fast. You don't teach a wild thing to hurry toward a house. She lifted the feather once more, smoothed its barbs back into line, and set it carefully across the stone. The gesture felt like answering a letter in the same handwriting it was sent. "I see you," she said, not loud. "I remember." The bear did nothing dramatic. He blinked. A small steam of breath rose and unraveled. Then he turned, slow as evening, and slipped back into the green where path becomes only deer guess and moss remembers last year's paw. Nora stood with her fingers braced on the doorframe until the quiet resumed its wider shape. She didn't bring the gifts inside. Not yet. She was old enough to know a conversation when it started, even if it used antler and stone instead of words. She made more bread, put a kettle on, laid a chipped saucer upside down over the honey jar, because she'd learned the hard way that tiny sugar ants wake the moment a story sweetens. On the fourth morning, she found a ring of mushrooms, not a fairy ring, not that neat, but a careful crescent, each cap placed, not growing. Birch boletes, small and firm, the good kind. She laughed then, softly, and with her mouth closed the way you do when laughter feels like prayer. "All right," she said to the damp air. "Bring what you will. I'll keep them safe." From the trees came nothing but a jay's scold and the long drip of water from cedar. But somewhere below that, Nora felt the old night's thread draw through her palms again, unbroken all this time. Gifts, then. If that was the language he'd chosen, she would answer in the only way that made sense, with a place kept tidy, a porch swept clear, and a space left open beside the door where the forest could set down whatever it loved most and know it was understood. On the morning the gifts changed, Nora woke before the sun had pushed over the ridge. The air was still and thin, the way it gets before a frost, though the calendar swore it was late spring. She wrapped herself in her thick cardigan and padded barefoot across the cabin's creaking floor, each board cool beneath her soles. When she opened the door, she expected something like the days before, another stone, another feather, perhaps a twist of pine bark polished by the creek. Instead, what she saw made her pause with one hand still on the latch. It was a bundle. Not neat, exactly, but deliberate. Birch bark curled into a loose cone, tied clumsily with a strip of vine. Inside, she saw colors, deep berry reds, sun-yellow lichen, and a single spray of white trillium flowers, still fresh, their petals beaded with dew. Nora crouched down and touched the birch bark. The vine knot was lopsided but held firm. It wasn't the kind of knot made by a person's fingers. It looked more like the twisting a bear might manage with patient teeth and a lot of trial and error. She lifted the bundle and caught the faint scent of river mud and crushed pine needles. It was beautiful in its way, but more than that, it felt personal. As though somewhere between the ravine years ago and this quiet porch, the bear had learned not just to find things but to arrange them. Her eyes went to the tree line. He was there. This time, he wasn't trying to blend in. He stood broadside to her porch, sunlight just beginning to burn through the mist behind him, his fur shining with the wet gleam of a morning walk. His head was slightly lowered, his gaze fixed on her in that way he had, not expectant, not demanding, but steady. "You made this?" she asked, lifting the bundle just enough for him to see. The bear shifted his weight, one massive paw forward in the dirt, and then, almost imperceptibly, he turned and began to walk toward the deeper woods. It wasn't hurried, but it wasn't idle either. He walked with the kind of direction you couldn't mistake for wandering. Every few steps, he glanced back, as if measuring whether she'd follow. Nora hesitated. The forest was her neighbor, but it could also be a stranger. And she was 78, with knees that sometimes protested going up the porch steps. But the bundle in her hands was warm from where he'd carried it in his mouth, and she thought of that first night, of his small body tucked against hers, of the way he'd trusted her without knowing her name. She set the bundle gently on the porch table, stepped into her boots, and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "All right," she said aloud, more to herself than him. "Lead on." The bear moved into the shadows beneath the pines, his shoulders rolling like the hills themselves. Nora kept to the patches of light where she could, using her walking stick to push aside fern fronds and steady herself on the softer ground. She noticed things she hadn't in years, the high whine of bees moving through the salal, the faint trickle of a hidden spring under the moss, the way the air cooled each time the wind came down from the ridge. The bear seemed to know the path by heart, pausing at turns long enough for her to catch up. They crossed the narrow creek, the water low enough to step from stone to stone without soaking her boots. On the other side, the trees opened into a small meadow she didn't remember, a clearing framed with alder and wild rose. And there, in the center, lay another bundle. This one was larger, wrapped not in bark but in broad leaves, bound with strips of cedar. Something inside shifted slightly when the breeze touched it. The bear walked to the bundle, then stepped back, leaving space for her. Nora approached slowly, bent down, and untied the cedar strip. The leaves fell open to reveal a pile of river stones, each one smooth, each one painted with streaks of mineral color, rust red, pale blue, soft green. In the center sat a single, perfectly round stone, no bigger than a robin's egg, the kind you could turn over in your palm forever. She looked up at him, her mouth curving despite herself. "You've been collecting." The bear didn't move, didn't make a sound, but in the quiet of the meadow, the truth felt simple: this was not chance. This was habit. This was his way of telling her something only he knew how to say. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just the keeper of his gifts. She was part of his route, part of his map. Somewhere out in the vast green, he'd chosen her porch as a destination, and now, perhaps, her footsteps as part of the journey. She gathered the stones carefully back into the leaves, tied them as he had, and tucked the bundle under her arm. "All right," she murmured again. "Let's take them home." The bear turned without prompting, leading her back toward the cabin, his pace slow enough for her to match. And for the first time in years, Nora felt less like a woman living alone in the mountains and more like someone expected. 2 mornings after the meadow, Nora woke to the sound of something heavy dropping onto the porch boards. It was not the polite thump of an antler or the delicate tap of a stone. This was weight, the kind that carried intent. When she stepped outside, the air was sharp and cool, mist still clinging low over the ground. There, just left of the doormat, lay the largest gift yet. It was a thick section of tree branch, heavy enough she had to use both hands to lift it, with deep grooves cut across the surface. At first she thought they were scratches from claws or teeth, but as she turned the branch in the light, the pattern looked deliberate. Almost like a mark. Her fingers traced the lines. 3 deep slashes side by side, then a gap, then another slash. Not random. Not weathering. The bear was standing in the yard, not at the tree line this time, but closer, close enough that she could see the wet sheen on his muzzle. He was still, but his eyes moved between her and the dark stretch of pines behind him. "You want me to see something," she murmured. She placed the branch on the porch table, then followed the direction of his gaze toward the trees. The shadows there were thicker than usual. The bear stepped forward, one slow, deliberate motion at a time, until he reached the edge of the porch. He stopped, turned toward the woods again, then looked back at her. It was the same look he'd given in the meadow, only sharper now, urging, almost. Nora's knees didn't like sudden decisions, but her mind was already made. She slipped on her boots, grabbed her walking stick, and stepped down onto the damp grass. "All right. Show me." They moved along the slope that dipped toward the creek, the bear keeping just ahead of her, ears flicking every time a branch cracked in the distance. The wind had shifted, it carried a scent she couldn't quite name but made her throat tighten, something sour and metallic. The path narrowed as they neared a cluster of alders. Here, the bear stopped. He lowered his head, nosing at the ground, then stepped aside so she could see. At the base of the largest alder, the earth was disturbed. Not the small, neat scratches of squirrels burying food, but broad, deep gouges as if something had been rooting or digging with force. The soil was fresh, still dark and damp where it had been turned over. Nora knelt as much as her knees allowed, resting one hand on her stick for balance. She brushed the soil back with her fingers and saw the pale edge of something hard beneath, not bone, but wood. It was the rounded corner of a crate, the kind used for storage or transport, buried under only a few inches of earth. Her stomach sank. People buried things in the forest for all kinds of reasons, but crates didn't belong here. And whatever was inside had drawn the bear close enough to notice, close enough to bring her warning. She looked up at him. "You wanted me to see this." The bear didn't move closer. He stood just far enough that the rising sun lit the front of his fur, a warm gold against the dark forest behind him. Nora knew she couldn't dig it out alone, not without risking her back, but she also knew leaving it there without knowing was worse. She marked the spot with a pile of river stones from the creek, stacking them carefully so she could find it again. When she straightened, the bear was already turning back toward the cabin, glancing over his shoulder once as if to check that she was following. Back on the porch, she placed the marked branch beside the other gifts. It looked out of place next to feathers and flowers, but she understood now, some gifts were meant to be kept, and some were meant to be read. That night, she lay awake longer than usual, listening to the wind move through the pines and wondering who, or what, had buried that crate. And she wondered, too, how many more messages the bear had been trying to send her before she learned to listen. The next morning, the bear was nowhere in sight. The forest edge stood quiet, and the porch was empty save for a single pine cone dropped in the exact center of the doormat. Nora stared at it for a long moment. It wasn't the usual kind of gift, no delicate arrangement, no hidden meaning she could guess, but it felt like a marker, a signal. Today. She knew she couldn't lift the crate on her own. She also knew she couldn't call just anyone. People in town had long memories, and the moment she mentioned a bear leading her to something buried, the story would twist into something she didn't recognize. So she chose carefully. Tom, her neighbor from 2 valleys over, was a man who knew when not to talk. He'd helped her mend fence in a hailstorm without saying more than a dozen words, and when he'd left, he hadn't told a soul about the elk antlers they'd found tangled in her orchard fence. When she called, she simply said, "Need help digging something out of the ground. Bring your gloves. And maybe a crowbar." An hour later, Tom's old pickup rattled up the drive. He stepped out, tipping his cap. "What are we looking at?" She just pointed toward the alders. The hike down was slower with 2, but the spot was easy to find. The bear's branch with the claw marks was still leaning against a nearby trunk, and her pile of river stones marked the disturbed soil. Tom knelt without comment and began digging with the short-handled spade he'd brought. The soil was loose enough to make progress quickly, and within minutes, the top of the crate was fully exposed. It was old, the wood weathered to a gray-brown, the metal bands around it spotted with rust. But the nails still held, and the lid didn't give easily. That's where the crowbar came in. With a grunt, Tom pried the first board loose, then another. The scent that escaped was faint but sharp, the same metallic tang she'd caught on the wind before. Inside, under a layer of rotting burlap, lay rows of glass jars. Each was sealed with a metal lid, the contents murky and dark. Some were cloudy with sediment, others clear enough to see what looked like pressed plant matter or soaked roots inside. Tom lifted one carefully, turning it in the light. "Herbs," he said finally. "Or something like it." He frowned. "Not the kind you'd keep in the pantry, though." Nora leaned closer. She didn't recognize the plants, but she could tell they'd been prepared with purpose. And judging by the smell, some were steeped in strong spirits. "Medicinal?" she asked. "Maybe," Tom said. "Or poison?" Hard to tell without opening one. She felt the bear's absence keenly in that moment, as if he should have been there to explain. They hauled the crate up in sections, each jar wrapped carefully in the burlap so it wouldn't shatter. Tom set them in the bed of his truck. "I can take these into town, get someone to test them. Might take a while." Nora hesitated. The bear had brought her here, not the sheriff, not the forest rangers. There was a reason. And part of her feared that once the wrong hands got involved, the real reason would be lost in paperwork. "No," she said finally. "Leave them here. I'll keep them in the shed for now." Tom raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. They carried the jars to the shed behind the cabin, stacking them in the corner where the cold would keep the worst of the scent down. By the time Tom left, the light was beginning to fade. Nora stood on the porch, watching the tree lean. She didn't know if the bear would return tonight or in 3 days, but she had the uneasy sense that the gifts, the stones, the feathers, even the branch, had been leading to this. And she had the stronger sense that the story wasn't finished. When the first stars began to blink through the deepening blue, she saw him, a dark mass moving with purpose along the edge of the meadow. He didn't come all the way to the porch this time. Instead, he stopped halfway, sitting back on his haunches, watching. "I found it," she called softly into the night air. "I have it." He didn't move, but she thought, or maybe imagined, that his head dipped once, slow and deliberate, before he turned and melted back into the trees. The morning after the crate was unearthed, Nora found the bear waiting before she even opened the door. He was sitting in the damp grass near the porch steps, his fur silvered with dew, a dark bundle resting between his front paws. His posture was different, not the calm patience she usually saw, but something tighter, almost urgent. When she stepped out, he rose and nudged the bundle toward her. It slid slightly on the wet boards, leaving a faint trail of soil and crushed leaves. Nora crouched, untied the loose binding of willow bark, and opened it. Inside was a single, broken glass jar. The neck and lid were still intact, but the bottom half had been shattered. Clinging to the remaining glass was a residue, dark, thick, and almost oily, with a sharp, bitter smell that made her recoil. The bear gave a low chuff, not aggressive but warning. His gaze shifted toward the tree-line, then back to the jar, then to her, as if urging her to understand. She stood slowly, cradling the shard in her palm, her mind moving through possibilities. The crate they'd dug up yesterday had been sealed and buried. This jar hadn't been. Which meant someone had been moving them. And if the bear had found this broken one, it meant he'd been watching more than just her porch. She carried the shard inside, wrapping it in an old cloth and setting it on the kitchen counter. Then she grabbed her walking stick and stepped back outside. "Show me," she said. The bear didn't hesitate. He turned toward the northern slope, where the land dipped into a hollow dense with spruce. The air grew cooler as they descended, the ground soft with years of fallen needles. Halfway down, she saw the first sign, a small scatter of glass on the forest floor, each piece glinting faintly in the filtered light. A few feet beyond, a stain darkened the moss, its edges already curling with decay. The bear moved ahead, stopping near a large fallen log. On the far side, hidden from the main path, lay the rest of the broken jar. The smell here was stronger, enough to sting her eyes. Nora crouched, using a twig to shift one of the shards. Beneath it, the moss was dead, turned brittle and gray. Nothing grew in the patch around it. She looked up at the bear, her voice low. "You're telling me this isn't medicine, aren't you?" He didn't respond, but his stillness felt like confirmation. Her thoughts went immediately to the jars in her shed. If this liquid could kill moss and stain the earth, what would it do in the wrong hands? And why had it been hidden here in the first place? She turned the broken piece of glass over in her hand, careful not to touch the residue, then slipped it into the pocket of her coat. "All right," she said, more to herself than him. "We'll deal with it." On the way back, the bear kept glancing behind them. Once, he stopped altogether, head lifted, nostrils flaring. Nora followed his gaze but saw only the dark layers of forest. Still, the prickle at the back of her neck told her they weren't alone. When they reached the cabin, she went straight to the shed. One by one, she checked the jars. All were intact, for now. She stacked them closer together, covering them with a heavy tarp. The bear stood in the yard, watching her until she finished. Then, without a sound, he turned and slipped back toward the woods. Nora knew he'd be back. But she also knew that next time, whatever he brought might not be just a gift. It might be a warning of something, or someone, getting closer. That night, Nora woke to a sound she couldn't place. It wasn't the wind, that had its own familiar language against the tin roof, and it wasn't the soft shuffle of deer passing through the yard. This was sharper. Closer. She lay still, listening. The sound came again, the faint crunch of gravel, followed by a pause, then another step. Whoever it was, they were moving slowly. Her cabin windows were dark, she hadn't lit the lantern after sunset. She slipped from bed, the floorboards cold under her bare feet, and reached for the flashlight she kept on the nightstand. She didn't turn it on yet. Instead, she eased toward the front window and parted the curtain just enough to see the yard. In the pale wash of moonlight, something near the shed moved. Not the hulking silhouette of the bear, this was smaller, human-shaped. The figure crouched near the door, hands working at the latch. Nora's breath caught. The jars. Before she could move, a shadow rose from the far edge of the yard. The bear. His shape was unmistakable even in the dim light, massive shoulders rolling forward, his head low. He crossed the grass in silence until he was less than 10 feet from the intruder. The figure froze, then stumbled backward, tripping over a pile of stacked wood. The bear didn't lunge, didn't roar. He simply stood his ground, blocking the path to the shed. His stillness was enough. The intruder scrambled to his feet and bolted toward the trees, vanishing into the darkness. Nora stayed by the window until the only movement in the yard was the slow rise and fall of the bear's breathing. He turned then, walking toward the porch. At the base of the steps, he paused, looking up at her window. She opened the door quietly, stepping out into the cool night air. The bear was close enough now that she could see the faint shine of moisture on his fur from the dew. Between his front paws lay something pale, a feather, long and striped, from a hawk. It wasn't like the other gifts. This one felt symbolic in a way she couldn't quite name. She crouched, picking it up, the barbs still smooth under her fingertips. "Thank you," she whispered. He watched her for another moment, then turned and walked back into the shadows. The next morning, the feather lay on her kitchen table, and the memory of the night stayed sharp. Someone had been after the crate's contents, and they would come again. Later that day, she noticed something else. The bear had left fresh prints in the soft earth leading from the woods straight to her porch. Not along the yard's edge, not in the usual places where he approached, but directly to her door, as if to remind her that she wasn't alone in this. From that day forward, the gifts began appearing closer and closer. A stone with a strange fossil, placed against the porch step. A sprig of cedar tucked against the doorframe. A strip of bark, freshly peeled and smelling of sap, leaning on the handle of the shed. Each one was deliberate. Each one felt like a quiet message. And though she couldn't yet translate them fully, she knew the meaning was circling closer to the truth. By the third day after the night intruder, Nora's porch looked like a small museum of forest offerings. The hawk feather lay beside the cedar sprig, the fossil stone rested near the strip of fresh bark, and the claw-marked branch from weeks before leaned against the wall. She sat at the kitchen table, the morning light spilling through the window, staring at the collection. Her coffee had gone cold, untouched. The bear wasn't just leaving random pieces of the forest, there was a pattern, she was sure of it now. The feather, the fossil, the cedar, the bark. Each seemed to point towards something specific, like clues to a place or an event. She took a notebook from the drawer and began sketching them roughly, writing small notes under each. The feather could be a warning about watching the skies, or about being watched. The fossil, something old buried in stone. The cedar sprig, a symbol of protection or purification. The bark, she didn't know yet. It wasn't until she picked up the cedar that she noticed the strip of bark had a faint, unfamiliar scent beneath the sharp tang of sap. She held it closer, her nose wrinkling. It was faintly metallic, just like the residue from the broken jar. Her stomach tightened. The bark hadn't come from a random tree in the forest. It had been peeled from a trunk that had been soaked in whatever was inside those jars. Which meant whoever had buried them, or was still moving them, had been working in that part of the forest recently. And the bear had been there? She set the bark down slowly and went to the shed. Pulling back the tarp, she checked each jar again. All were still intact, but the faint smell seemed stronger now, as if the liquid inside had been disturbed. Nora stood for a long moment, weighing her options. She could move the jars farther from the cabin, but that would risk losing them entirely, and she suspected that might be exactly what someone wanted. Instead, she closed the shed door, locked it, and returned to the porch. The bear was there, sitting at the edge of the yard, watching her. "I think I understand," she said quietly. "You're not just warning me. You want me to find where this came from." The bear rose then, turning toward the tree line. He walked a few steps, paused, and looked back at her. It was the same gesture he'd made the day she found the crate. Nora grabbed her walking stick, slipped her notebook into her coat pocket, and followed. They traveled deeper into the forest than she'd been in years, crossing the narrow creek twice, moving into older growth where the trunks were thick and the air cooler. The bear's pace never faltered. Finally, they came to a stand of massive cedar trees, their lower trunks scarred where bark had been stripped away. The ground here was littered with scraps, small shards of glass, strips of burlap, and here and there, dark stains that made the earth brittle. Nora crouched, running her fingers lightly over the scarred wood. This was where it had happened, where the jars had been stored, maybe even made. The bear stood behind her, the sunlight flickering through the branches onto his fur. He didn't move, didn't need to. She understood. Whoever had been here before wasn't finished. And now, she wasn't just a bystander, she was part of whatever was coming next. The cedar grove was quiet in that heavy way that told Nora it wasn't truly empty. She stayed crouched, fingers resting on the stripped trunk, eyes scanning the space between the trees. The bear shifted his weight, head turning slightly toward the eastern edge of the grove. His ears pricked forward, muscles tense. Then she heard it, the faint crack of a twig underfoot, followed by the hush of fabric brushing against bark. Whoever it was, they were close. Nora rose slowly, her walking stick steady in her grip. "I know you're there," she called, her voice even but carrying. The silence stretched for a moment before a figure stepped out from behind a cedar. He was tall, lean, with a weathered face half hidden beneath a hood. His boots were caked in mud the same dark shade as the stains around the trees. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low but sharp. "I could say the same," Nora replied. His gaze flicked to the bear, who stood a few paces behind her. The man's jaw tightened. "That animal's been following me for weeks. Scaring me off my own land." Nora shook her head. "This isn't your land. And those jars you've been burying, they're not just dangerous for the forest. They're dangerous for anyone who comes near them." He smirked. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," she said, stepping closer. "I know the smell kills moss and strips bark. I know you came to my cabin at night. And I know you're not burying medicine out here." His eyes narrowed, but before he could answer, the bear took a deliberate step forward. It wasn't a charge, just a warning, the weight of his presence filling the space between them. The man's hand twitched toward his coat pocket. Instinctively, Nora shifted her stance, placing herself between him and the bear. "Don't," she said firmly. He froze, eyes darting between them. Then he took a small step back. "You don't understand what's in those jars," he muttered. "And you don't want to." Then tell me, she pressed. For a moment, she thought he might. But instead, he turned sharply, disappearing into the deeper trees with a speed that belied his frame. The bear growled low in his throat, the sound vibrating through the stillness. Nora felt it in her bones. She knew the man would be back, and whatever was in those jars, he wasn't finished with it. She turned to the bear. We can't leave them where they are. He stood still for a long moment, then began walking back toward the path they'd come from, glancing over his shoulder once as if to make sure she was following. The message was clear: the jars needed to be moved, somewhere safe, somewhere the man couldn't find them. And they needed to do it soon. By the time Nora and the bear reached the cabin, the sky was bruising toward dusk. The encounter in the cedar grove had left her rattled, but she didn't waste time. If the man returned tonight, she needed the jars gone. She unlocked the shed and pulled back the tarp. The smell hit her immediately, sharper than before, almost metallic on her tongue. She wrapped each jar in burlap, securing them with twine, then set them into a pair of old grain sacks. Even with only half the crate's contents in each, they were heavy enough to strain her back. The bear stood at the edge of the yard, head turning toward the tree line every few seconds. Watching. Guarding. I can't carry both, she muttered, looking at the second sack. Before she could decide what to do, the bear padded forward, lowered his massive head, and gripped the sack's top gently between his teeth. She froze. Careful, if one of those breaks. But he moved with surprising delicacy, the sack hanging steady from his jaws. Together, they began the slow climb up the ridge behind the cabin, taking a narrow game trail that twisted between boulders and thick undergrowth. It was a hard climb. More than once, Nora had to stop to catch her breath, the weight of the sack biting into her shoulders. The bear would wait ahead, setting down his burden only when she paused, watching her with that quiet, patient gaze. They reached a small plateau just as the last streaks of daylight slipped away. From here, she could see the valley spread out below, her cabin a faint outline in the dim light, the cedar grove beyond that. At the center of the plateau stood a half-collapsed hunting shack, its roof sunken but its stone foundation still solid. The bear walked to the far side, where the earth had eroded into a shallow pit beneath the wall. He dropped the sack gently and stepped back. Nora understood. She lowered her own sack beside his and began pushing both into the pit. The bear joined in, using his paws to scrape soil over them, packing the earth tight. By the time they finished, the stars were bright overhead. She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, her breath clouding in the cool air. That's when she noticed something, a shape half buried near the wall of the shack. She crouched, pulling it free. It was another jar, but unlike the others, it wasn't cloudy or cracked. The liquid inside shimmered faintly in the starlight, with a strange, almost golden hue. The bear stepped closer, his nose nearly touching the glass. He gave a short huff, the sound uneasy. "This one's different," Nora murmured. She slipped it into her coat pocket, not entirely sure why she didn't bury it with the others. Something told her it might be important, a key to understanding what the man had been doing. The bear gave a final look toward the valley before turning toward the trail home. Nora followed, her hand resting on the jar in her pocket. She didn't know it yet, but by keeping it, she had just ensured the man would come back. And next time, he wouldn't be alone. The wind picked up the following night, carrying with it the scents of pine, damp soil, and something that didn't belong. Smoke. Nora had been sitting by the wood stove, turning the golden-hued jar over in her hands, when the bear appeared at the edge of the yard. His fur was bristled, his movements sharper than usual. He didn't wait for her to follow, he turned and headed straight for the ravine. She set the jar in her pack, slung it over her shoulder, and grabbed her walking stick. By the time she caught up, they were already moving along the lower slope toward the cedar grove. That's when she saw the light, thin, erratic beams weaving between the trunks. Lanterns. At least 3 of them. The bear stopped, his body low to the ground. Nora followed his gaze. The hooded man from before was there, and he wasn't alone. 2 others moved with him, each carrying burlap sacks that sagged heavily at the bottom. They found more, she whispered. The men were talking in low voices, but the words were too faint to catch. They moved toward the center of the grove, where fresh pits had been dug. Nora's breath caught as she saw one man pull a jar from his sack, not the cloudy kind, but one like hers, the liquid inside glinting faintly even in the dark. She realized suddenly that the golden liquid wasn't just different, it was valuable. And whatever it was, they were willing to risk everything to keep it hidden. The bear shifted, his massive form blending into the shadows. Then, with a force that broke the tense stillness, he stepped into the lantern light. The reaction was immediate. One man stumbled backward, dropping his sack. Another reached for something at his belt, but the hooded leader barked, "Don't. Not here." Nora stepped out behind the bear, her voice steady. "You're done burying this poison in my forest." The leader's eyes locked on her pack. "You have one of them." "I have the truth," she said. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the bear let out a sound Nora had never heard from him, not a roar, but a deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the earth. It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning that this was his ground. The men faltered. One broke first, turning and vanishing into the trees. The second followed. The hooded leader lingered, his gaze flicking between Nora and the bear, as if calculating whether the jar in her pack was worth the risk. Finally, he stepped back. "This isn't over," he said, before disappearing into the shadows. The grove was quiet again, save for the rustle of wind through cedar branches. Nora exhaled, her knees trembling from the tension. The bear turned to her then, and between his teeth was something new, a strip of weathered leather, stamped with a faded emblem. She took it, brushing away the dirt. It was a badge. It didn't belong to any hunter or trapper she knew. Whoever those men were, they weren't just criminals, they were part of something larger. Nora slipped the badge into her pocket alongside the jar. She didn't know what it all meant yet, but she knew she wasn't facing it alone. The bear gave one slow blink, then began walking back toward the cabin. She followed, the golden liquid in her pack sloshing softly with each step, the badge warm in her palm. The gifts he brought weren't just tokens from the forest anymore. They were pieces of a puzzle, and together, they'd just taken the first step toward solving it.